Animating buttons. We've seen how efficient transitions can be. Let's see if we can apply this approach to animating a button's default, hover and active states. In this lesson, we'll create a hover state for a button with a stylized animated drop shadow, as well as create the animation for when the button is clicked. The result should be a button that feels fun and intuitive to interact with. To get started, open the Module 2 sample code zip file and look for folder 04 start in the 02 folder. A completed version of this lesson's code is in the folder 04 end. Here's what we're aiming for. The button seems to move forward toward us on hover. It brightens and the shadow grows to make it feel like it's moving further from the page. Then on click, the button presses down flat. To begin with, we have some simple HTML for the button. For the purposes of this example, we're using a link in this case, but you could always use a button if you prefer. To get things set up, I have some basic styles in place, but we'll be overriding these to build the button with a shadow that we can animate. To do this, we'll use a favorite of mine, the pseudo element. The first thing we do is remove the background. In our buttons.css file in the Style Sheets folder, create a new style block for the button class. Here we set the background to none, as well as the text decoration. We also set the position to relative so that we can position our pseudo elements using absolute positioning. With the background gone, we'll use two pseudo elements instead, one with the shadow color and a second with the button color. We begin with a button before pseudo element. This is the grey shadow, so we give it a slightly transparent grey color. We set a border radius to round the corners, and then set the empty content property, and position the pseudo element so that it sits slightly down from the top and beneath the bottom of the container. Lastly, we set the Z index to -1. We want this shadow to sit behind our content. Next, we'll create the foreground color. In a button after pseudo element, we again set the background color. Green this time. Then border radius and content before positioning it also. This time it covers the container entirely. Again, we set the Z index to -1 so that it sits behind the text. Because this is the after pseudo element, it will sit in front of the shadow even though they both share the same Z index value. Checking our progress, we should now see a nicely styled button with a grey shadow peeking out beneath. For our button to grow on hover, we'll need to scale it up. In our buttons.css file, we add a button hover state. To ensure the underline stays hidden, we set text decoration to none. We'll add a transform that scales the button up to 1.1 times its usual size. Next, we want to move the shadow down a bit. We create a style block called button hover before. This means that when the hover state is entered, the following styles will apply to the before pseudo element. Here we'll push the shadow down by 0.1 em. This should be enough to make it look like the shadow is getting further from the button. We'll now change the button color on hover by setting the color on the after pseudo element. With this in place, we now have a hover state. But we're not done yet. Let's also add in the active state. This is the state that the link or button goes into when it's pressed. We add a button active block, and within this we transform the button down by 0.2 em. Because we're not setting the scale here, it'll scale back down to its normal size. Lastly, we want to remove the shadow in the active state. Since the visual effect we're going for is that of a button pressing flat to the page, there should be no shadow. So we'll pull it up underneath the button. We add a button active before state. In this, we set a transform to move the shadow up by 0.1 em. This should be enough to hide it under the button. Let's see it in action. It looks like it has the 3 stages all right, but it could do with being smoother. Let's smooth these states with transitions. We can now use transitions to smooth the flow between these states. We have 3 elements, the button, as well as the before and after pseudo elements. We can list them and then apply one transition to all 3 of these. The transition will apply to all properties, have a duration of 0.5 seconds, and will use the exponential ease out timing function. This should mean that any changing properties that can be animated, such as transforms or colors, will be animated on hover, active state, and then back to the original starting position. Let's see how this looks. This looks better, but not right yet. The active state still has a squishiness to it. Depending on your design, this might work, but I think it would be better if this button pressed down immediately. To do this, we can make use of the transition's target state, and the transition then applies in that direction. In this case, back in our CSS, we can apply a transition to the 2 active states. We add a transition of none to each of the active and active before states. This means that the change from hover to pressed will be sudden. Let's check. We can now see the effect. The button clicks down quickly, but still animates up to the hover position when the click is released. In this lesson, we learned how to create an animated button with 3 states. We used pseudo elements and animated both the hover and active states. We also used multiple transitions to change the feel of the animation between these states. In the next section, you'll find some links to more examples of link hover animations, tooltip styles, and button animations. Feel free to download them, be inspired, and even use them on your own projects if you wish.